Hi, I'm Mike Haber doing this talk tonight. Problem solving on hard mode. What doesn't kill us doesn't kill us. A little bit of background about myself first. I've got 20 years experience in the IT kind of industry, really, pretty much doing full stack of from talking to customers to designing systems to building them, testing them, and then getting out of bed when they go wrong. So I've done a lot of stuff. Recently, I've done a lot more work, helping people make sense of their problems and draw them. And so this talk is actually a mixture of them both, really. As we go on, I'll explain how it all works. But this slide is an overview of the talk. I'm going to start talking about problem solving, show you a problem where the ideal approach didn't apply. But I'm going to show you the fix pretty much straight away. The fourth slide, sorry, is the fix. There'll be some reviews. I'll talk about how I managed the people solving the problem and how we decided what to do next. There'll be another review and some questions and some advice for the future. So that's that. Let me start this as a meeting, which gives me that. So can everyone see this okay? Give me a thumbs up. I can only see Pedro. Okay, so what I did first, though, is because you have to use ChatGPT for everything. I asked ChatGPT about films that explain the end at the beginning and the rest of the film is about the details. And it turns out ChatGPT told me if the big reveal or the climax of the story is at the beginning, it's known as inverted structure or flash forward narrative. Blah, blah, blah. But, films like The Sixth Sense, Fight Club, or Prestige do that. So, I'm going to be doing that. Basically, I'll tell you what the problem was and what the solution was, and then rather than being a whodunit, it's going to be a, what we did, really. So let me just go back to this one. After this talk, you'll have some takeaways for problem solving. The hard mode actually refers to computer games where everyone is trying to kill you and you've got one life and limited time. In this particular problem, the technical expertise was spread across many teams with deep knowledge required, but you're just not sure where. And the clock is ticking on a 1 in 20 year problem. I only really saw a problem this difficult once in my entire experience. And I cover, how to manage helpful suggestions from concerned stakeholders. And I cover, how too much lean from lean consultants might kill you, but also how not enough lean might also kill you. I'm not going to reveal the organization. However, everything the organization did and the colleagues I work with all did the right thing. And with hindsight, I wouldn't change anything. So if I did tell you what the organization was, it would just be to say, how great my colleagues were. Okay, so it's not a whodunit. I'm going to tell you whodunit at the start. But the incident I'm going to talk about lasted 6 weeks. Okay, let's get on. But actually, as well as telling you who done it, I'm going to straight away talk about, okay, I'm going to jump here, the takeaways. The takeaways of this talk, which I will revisit at the end, are that people and stakeholders make sense. You have to find out how. I don't know what that grey box is there for. I'm going to talk about how you have to manage the framing of the problem. Lots of different opinions, are welcome, but actually framing the problem of this is what's happening is vital. I'm going to talk about how the most important concern you have is the expert's brain state and the rules that govern the work, and how without those, you're not going to fix anything. I'm going to talk about always have a visual to point at when you're discussing problems, because without it, you'll be pointing at people, and that's usually not great. And I'll talk about managing communications because trust is an emergent property. And there will be some extra takeaways. So rather than this being a whodunit on what happened, at the end, before I reveal the extra takeaways, if I've got time, I'll ask and see if you've got any. So basically, I told you I'd tell you what the problem was, and then I'll talk about what the context of the problem was and how we solved it. So the problem was, at the end of this incident, we found out that a model of networks which we used was putting between 0 and 10 active connections into eco mode at random times each day. So the port would just stop working for 300 seconds, 0 traffic on the network, and then it would just start again. So the switch was actually up to date with firmware, and the fix was a new firmware update. We were already running the latest firmware. Of course, the fix was not mentioned in the patch release. So really, that's what this talk's going to be about. We had a P1 incident. I'll explain why it was priority 1 and what could have gone wrong. But essentially, it was caused by a network switch. It was as if someone cheeky was pulling the network cable out of your computer and then 5 minutes later putting it back in. But this was happening at random times. Okay. So it's kind of having a review. There's a sick feeling you get when you've got a problem that needs sorting. It might not be your fault and you don't know how to fix it, and you've been awake half the night, get out of bed and you still need to go to work, and you're actually going to go further towards the problem. And technical problems, are fairly, we know how to solve those. It's science. You can define the problem, find out what your evidence is, work out how to recreate it and isolate it. And then using a test system, test half the problem space, get feedback quickly, narrow down on the issue. It's science, and I'm a scientist. I have a degree in physics. How hard can this be? Many systems have diagnostic trees. Well, this was a real life priority 1 incident. It would have got the organization had it carried on in the national media, and it was a once in 20 years type problem. So it needed a different approach to the regular 99% problem solving that you have. It was literally on hard mode. And it was also one of those random problems that are really hard to find. So again, I'll reiterate, I'm not going to tell you who is to blame. Everyone acted in the best way they could, and I'll be happy working them with the future. And there will be takeaways here if you're a developer, if you're in operations, service management, or if you're in a leadership role. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? I can't see the chat.
All good in terms of the chat.
Okay. So hopefully you all know, where we were. Let me talk about the context we were in. I'll just move on a slide. But the context we were in was we're an education provider. And if a newspaper was writing a headline, we have one job, give students a grade. And we did that by using an online exam system, which was developed in-house and hosted in-house. And our one job involves students taking the exam without incident. And we're dependent on the IT service for the volume of exams we run. Paper, is not really an option anymore. It's painful and expensive. So basically, we could be talking about the future for you or one of your kids or your grandkids, their education. Their education provider, less than 1% of them is having a problem in their exam. They're doing their exam and their machine is basically being taken off the network for 5 minutes at a time. So define the problem. Well, what's the evidence we had? Well, there's always a baddie for any story as well, and that baddie is that mobile phone in the middle. That's the exam mobile that rings whenever there's a problem with an exam. And on the left there of the timeline, we have an exam invigilator who's usually a kind of generally a trusted retired person, dresses really smart and will oversee an exam, but they're not very technical. And they'd phone up and say, well, a computer stopped working and we had to move the student to another computer. Everything is working again now, but the student is very unhappy. And, they were expecting to get an A triple star, for example, and they've only got a C. And they're blaming the fact that their computer went wrong. So they want extenuating circumstances. Now, you might guess at this point what the problem was, but I've already told you. One of the network switches was basically putting the computers into sleep mode for 300 seconds for 5 minutes. So we know that tens of exactly the same exam worked fine at exactly the same time in the same room and elsewhere too. But this keeps happening, and it happens between 0 and 10 times each day. So it took a few phone calls to realize there's actually a problem we need to solve, because basically, it went away after 5 minutes. But of course, when we realized this was a problem that wouldn't go away, we knew that we were currently doing mock exams, but in a few weeks we'd be running real life exams, and we would get on the front page of the education news. They had one job. All they had to do was assess their students without problem. So we really wanted to avoid that. We're deciding young people's futures. This is bad. So with our problem solving, we want to define the problem. What are the boundaries? Where does the problem lie? So we got around a whiteboard, and this is the sort of thing we drew. Hopefully you can read this. I will go through it quite quickly, but this might be familiar to a few of you. We don't make computer services like this anymore, but this is how we did it at the time. There was an application we wrote, Apache PHP, MySQL, Redis, lived on a server operating system in a virtualized environment. We had redundancy and high availability. We had 2 data centers. Server operating systems, data center networks, miles of local networks, DNS, DHCP, client PC hardware, operating systems, patches, browsers, and users. So between the service and the user, it's a whole load of stuff. But we kind of knew the problem definitely lives there. However, we're a big-ish organization, and actually there are teams of people with managers for the teams who look after the different parts. There's a service management team. There's a network team. There's a server operating system team that I was part of. There's an application team. I had one foot in that team as well, which is why people looked to me to fix this. But there was a client operating system team. A whole load of people looking at this going, oh, right, it could be us. And there's a whole load of perspectives, that come with this. So some of those perspectives, well, if you're at the top or near the top, your perspective is just fix this. I don't want to end up in the news. So, here's some resources, Mike, but really just fix this. I don't really want to hear excuses. It's not negotiable. You might have had people from maybe outside the immediate hierarchy saying, well, it's their own fault, for using this in-house software. I told them they should have done something else. And maybe a popular perspective is, I hope it's not me. I hope this isn't my fault. I don't want to be in the spotlight for this. And another perspective I had was my colleague said, Mike, I'll help you out. You can have all my time and knowledge I want, but don't blame me. I know my systems are patched and reliable. This is not my problem. I'm patched and reliable. There's no errors. So there's some perspectives that, were understandable. And that's where the first takeaway comes from. All these perspectives are rational and make sense in the context and the performance review structure, the person was in. We literally employed someone to review and rationalize our IT architecture. Of course, they were going to suggest bespoke solutions need to be replaced. It's literally in their performance review. So takeaway 1 is everyone makes sense. You have to understand people's context and values, and then you can communicate more effectively, even if it's just to say, I understand your perspective and where you're coming from, but until this is fixed, this isn't helping. And those people could be seen to have user needs. Make sure you manage their perspectives and make sure you manage the perspectives and framing of the situation so people's user needs get met. And if there are perspectives you don't understand, if there are people who are saying things that don't make sense to you, go and find out how they make sense. Your people and your stakeholders all make sense, but you have to find out how. Okay. So the problem, as a big picture, the problem could be anywhere. Lots of things have 300 timeouts, 5 minutes. And there are lots of different people who want the problem fixed, lots of different perspectives. Everyone already has too much work. The problem's not owned or understood by one person in detail, and we can't recreate this issue. It's only happening in one room. And feedback on a change, well, it can take days. We change something, and until we see a fault again, we don't know if it's been fixed. So there's no certainty a fix has worked. We're fixing on live, and until we, it can be days. The feedback loop between making a change and finding out that it hasn't fixed the problem can be a long time. And very senior people are aware of the issue. In a couple of 6 weeks or so, it's going to be a disaster. But also everyone looking at this has loads of other things to do. They're busy, they're doing work. They really don't want this to, they don't want this to land on their lap, basically. Okay, first I should point out, maybe you're thinking, but this only happened in one room. This doesn't make any sense, Mike. But actually, this was a problem all over the place. It turns out we had these switches in another building. And once I'd patched the switches, I went to see the local IT tech, and it turns out he'd been getting a problem for months where people were saying to him, my computer just stops working. And then it'd turn up and it'd be fixed by the time he arrived. You might be familiar with this sort of problem. So there was a story that if your computer stopped working, just go for a coffee. Or if you're in a lab, move to the next machine. And it'll be okay when you got back. So around the organization, there was blame. Central IT messed up Outlook, Active Directory, DNS. Everything just freezes every now and then. So that was the story. Trust really, only goes downwards. I don't expect it came back quickly. But essentially having, 60 students in a room really caring that their exam worked for 3 hours was the number of canaries in the coal mine we needed for this problem to actually manifest itself and get the resources it needed to be resolved. So we had a problem. The context, we had a team of people who really didn't want it to be them. It's kind of my job to corral them to fix it. And it didn't really fit the kind of problem that you want to solve. Really long feedback loops. It's really hard to recreate. We're testing on live. Hopefully, and you now know the problem and what it was. You can see how difficult it would be to find. Yeah, so 20 minutes in, I've spoiled the whodunit. There's a really serious problem that rightly will get us in the news. We know what the problem is. Between 0 and 10 computers will have random issues. There's a group of people. The problem belongs to one of us. Is there any questions at this point in the chat that I can answer that might help you understand? If I've blown your brain, I'm really sorry. Okay. So I'm moving through the talk now. I'm now into the third part of, we know what the problem was. We kind of know the context. We've been going 23 minutes, so we're kind of on time. So one drawing I did is this one. And what this is a kind of hierarchy diagram, but it's like a hierarchy of needs. And to meet the top need, you need to meet the needs below it. And this kind of gives an overview of the next part of the talk. In order to solve the problem, we need to understand it, but we also need to communicate our progress. And I'll explain why that's important in a moment. To understand the problem, we need to get people to collaborate because the knowledge doesn't live in one person's mind. We need to have a plan of action that I'll talk about, and we need to stay blame-free. And we do that by pointing at pictures, not at each other, and taking an evidence-first approach. So here I'm going to talk about what we did. But first, before I talk about what we did, I needed to frame the problem and have a plan. Unfortunately, these frames existed in the organization, but they didn't get any traction. You might recognize some of these. someone says, right, who's to blame? Who messed up? Because there's been problems before and someone messed up. We found people who want to know who it was. We had managers who said, my staff are going nowhere near this problem. They've got plenty of work. This problem stinks, really. Luckily, they weren't the managers of the people I needed. But we had people saying, I told you if we use Linux, this would happen. Well, yeah. It's completely reasonable suggestion, but as we know, Linux wasn't the problem here. Equally, we had people who would come back from conferences and would say, we need to replace it with all this new tech that I've just found out about. It's a perennial problem. Anything you do, you should replace it with the latest tech. But people are also saying we need to outsource this. And of course, their job might have been outsourcing things in the organization. It's totally understandable. They've actually put it in the cloud. But of course, we know if we put it in the cloud, the problem would still have been there because it was right next to the computers in the room where we were doing the exams. And then there was someone saying it's DNS. Yeah, that person was really good. They knew what they were talking about. In this case, it wasn't DNS, but you should always have someone who suggests that as the first fix. Anyone who's worked in fixing IT problems will be familiar with that. So yeah, I needed a frame. This is the kind of environment that other frames are competing with. And of course, humans are natural pattern spotters. I told you that this problem would take 2 or 3 days to appear sometimes. So I turn up for work and people would have seen patterns and they'd have ideas. And if I read all these things, it takes about 90 seconds. I won't read them all, but it does give you an idea of the kind of helpful environment I was in when people would say, is it an IP address range? Oh, it's odd numbered computers. Maybe it's when the backups overrun. Maybe it's when the server load gets above a certain number. It was DNS last time. Are we hitting an Apache client's limit? Is it a hacker? Have the students tried to access Google during the exam and we're blocking their internet access for 5 minutes? Does the client ask for a DHCP lease renewal? Is that huge electromagnet in my machine next door running? Is that causing interference? Have you switched it off and on again? So pretty much I have a team and I have lots of helpful people, all with ideas about what it might be. And to be fair, all of these ideas are really good. If you've got a problem and you test all of these things, you're mainly going to find the problem. In this case, we don't. So it's useful to separate what you have as evidence. Do we have evidence for it being DHCP, or is there some inference that it's DHCP, for example? And is the inference weak or strong? This is quite useful when people give you, ask you things. You can ask whether they're, what they're inferring and how strong their inference is. Okay, let me just get to where I'm going. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll tell you how we framed this. And this framing is what I said to the team of people who were assembled to fix this. I kind of said, well, we've got a problem and we don't know where it is, but we need to fix it. And there are some things that we just need to check to make sure we're not stupid, the thing that failed last time. However, I'm not going to suggest the problem is with any part of the service without evidence. Inference is not good enough. I'm not going to suggest the problem is anywhere without evidence. I said, I'll manage the process and I'll ask you when I need help. And if you're struggling to get time, ask your manager. Yeah. And I did this because brain state is the most important thing. If people feel they're being attacked or blamed, they often go into a fight, flight, or freeze mode. Imagine the last time that someone blamed you for something you didn't do. You instructively want to defend yourself or get away, depending on the hierarchy, but you're not in a good brain state to help solve a problem. So I couldn't risk blaming people and then actually having to ask them for help. That wouldn't have happened. But we also work best when we know what the rules are. If we're wondering if we're going to get thrown under the bus next time, we're probably not going to be at our best either. We might be glad that the finger's pointing at someone else, but if we're not sure it's going to come to us, we're going to be worried. So as well as the frame that said, I'm not going to blame you unless there's evidence. When I say blame, I'm not going to say the problem is in your area without evidence. I also need some rules, and those rules needed to be seen to be followed. And those rules would decide what part of the IT stack we're going to look at next. And of course, we're turning up every day, and we're getting lots of people saying, why don't you try this? And why don't you try that? And maybe it's something else. Okay, so the takeaways here are you have to manage the framing of the problem, because if you don't manage the frame and say, we're not going to suggest the problem is in a particular area without evidence, people are not going to be happy and they're not going to want to help you. So the most important concerns are the brain state, make sure no one's blamed, make sure people know what the rules are. With those two things, people can be working in a good state. And takeaway 3B, separate evidence from inference if you can. Now, of course, when I say I need to manage people's brain states, I'm not talking about what's on the left here. This is not people being a separate thing, and me being outside the problem and saying I need to manage those people's brain states. I'm part of the problem. I'm in it. I'm literally in the group of people. And yes, my colleagues sometimes had to manage my brain state by saying, I need to get Mike a coffee and a cake. If there's a problem, chances are you're in it. So this wasn't a system where I could reach in and change things and it would do them. I was in it too. If you're familiar with systems thinking, that's like second order cybernetics. There are no problems that you're really not part of. So in order to understand the problem and work out what to test next, I created a visual of the end-to-end service. Now this was in the form of a mind map, and examples on the left there. And crucially, this is not the same as what was on the whiteboard earlier, because this is different. I'll explain why. Firstly, I made this by doing something called clean language interviewing with people. And clean language interviewing is a way of talking to people and finding out what they know, but without what you already think you know having an effect. So, you try and find out without the things other people have told you before affecting you. And I made this mind map that goes from top to bottom, and the top is the desktop clients and all the different parts of the desktop clients and all the settings for DHCP and browsers and things. And it goes in order through the client, the local area network, different network switches, the wider network, the data center network, the local network to the server, which I think was virtualized, the server, the application, the databases, and the file store. And when I created this, there were two things that needed to happen. Firstly, everyone had to agree that this was true. I had to interview people, create this, and then everyone got the chance to say whether they thought that was an accurate representation of the truth. And they could ask questions about other people's parts of the diagram. And what this allowed us to do is basically, if we could rule out large parts of the infrastructure by checking things in the right place. But in order to get trust, what I said was, we all have to agree in advance on the exact test we're doing, what we expect to see, and the results, what the results would mean before we do the test. If the team didn't agree on a test and didn't agree what conclusions we'd draw, we didn't do the test if it was inconclusive. And there were some tests that some senior people suggested. We were able to point at this map and go, well, that test is here, but the results are inconclusive. They don't rule in or out large parts of the infrastructure, so we're not going to do them. So here, check 1, the arrow at the top, might rule out more infrastructure than check 2, which is, inside check 1. For example, taking a client, a whole computer, and swapping it with another one tests more than just changing the network drivers on the client. And check 3 might be an important person's idea, and we can evaluate it. It might be the hippo, highest paid person in the room might have an idea to check something. But what we could do, we could look at the diagram and say, your check is here, and it rules out this much infrastructure. But what we think is better is this other check. So you could literally tell important people that you weren't going to do what they suggested. And just to show how that works, for this map, the position of the items in this map on the screen is important. We wanted tests that were as far left as possible, because then it ruled out all the stuff on the right-hand side, and as central as possible to rule out as much infrastructure as possible. And because we did this, I agreed with the test team had to agree on the check, what it tested, what was likely to happen, and the bits of infrastructure it ruled in and out. This maintained trust with the team I was working with. They knew I wasn't going to throw them under a bus by suggesting it was something in their area when that test, it didn't make sense with the evidence we had. And another way to talk about that is, other people's ideas. You can ignore them on the left-hand side of this scale and just listen to the experts, or you should listen to everyone and spend time checking everything everyone comes up with. And of course, neither is correct. And we had some senior people have some great ideas on tests, but we could assess everything against this end-to-end visual I created and tell people that we wouldn't do their thing, and they could see why. And largely that's how I managed the team. They knew they weren't going to get thrown under the bus, and we didn't do a test unless everyone agreed what it did. This is quite different from if you're a programmer and you've wrote the program and you're debugging it and you know it's something you've done. You really don't have to do all this work. However, there's another type of trust. And again, that only goes one way with time. Does management think Mike can fix this? If you remember, we're in exams, and pretty soon, if we don't fix this, plan B is going to get invoked. Plan B is we'll do paper-based exams and we'll employ lots of people, and it's going to be awful and loads of administration, and people will be laughing at us. So what did I do to manage trust, to get people to trust me that I could fix this? Well, I created a flowchart in Visio because that's what managers like. And it's basically a RACI diagram. RACI, R-A-C-I on the left-hand side is who's responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. And on that, we put something from systems theory, John Boyd's OODA, which is where you observe, you orient, you make sense of what you observe, you decide what to do, and you act. And in this case, the act was, this is the change we're going to make. But we didn't make a change without discussing what we were going to observe and what it meant. So if we didn't agree to do a change or a test, unless we'd agreed what we'd see and what the results meant. But crucially, what this diagram had is everyone knew when results were going to be communicated. When they were saying, is it fixed yet? I could point at this and say, we're at this point here. This is the change we last made. This is what we're looking for. And if we see it or not, this is what we will know. So everyone knew people knew when they were going to be communicated to. And this is another example of always have a visual to point at when you're discussing problems. Because without it, you'll be pointing at people, telling them that what's in their head isn't quite right. That's never great. Okay. For a second there, I saw some questions in the chat that I'd like to answer, but I will get to those. Well, firstly, I'll run through this overview. So the overview of Mike's problem solving is pretty much this. On the left-hand side of this graph, the first things you do is you test DNS. It's always the problem. You test what went wrong last time. You test things that make you look silly if you miss them and you test and revert recent changes. And often this works. And if you've been in the IT industry a couple of years, you can do this without blinking, really. But if that doesn't work, you have to increase your effort. For me, I have to bring in scientific problem solving, start writing things down. And in this case, I needed to have a follow the best thing plan. I need to think about blame. I need to think about trust. Fortunately, less than 1% of your problems are here. But of course, on the time axis on the bottom, there's a dotted line. And at some point, plan B, we're going to ignore these pesky online exams and we're going to go to paper-based exams. That would have been decided by a committee, which I was not on. So that's quite important. This slide kind of shows, what was going on with, we have the big diagram on the top left of the big whiteboard and all the teams that are there. But by creating a set of rules and by having trust, basically people provided, balloons, they provided cover for the person who was essentially doing the work, who was solving the problem. And that was quite nice and quite unexpected. If you've worked in IT, it's not always the case. When something goes wrong, usually there's someone to blame. And people definitely have opinions on who that is. Okay, so we did have to solve a problem. And in the end, we ended up having a bunch of computers using Wi-Fi to basically just skip part of the network. So we could rule that bit of the network in and out. It was either going to be the network or it was going to be the computer where the problem was. So in the room, we always left half the computers as is as a control, and we changed the others. We set up some using Wi-Fi. I don't remember how. But we set up the test that both the person managing the network and the person managing the computers agreed that, we get a result and it will determine where the problem lies. And we set up this test when the room was empty, and the computers beeped at us when they lost their network, so we didn't have to keep an eye on them all. So when the results pointed to the switch that was the problem, the person from that team said, "Right, it's me. I'll get back to you when I fixed it." And everyone else went, "Oh, thank God for that." And this is not what usually happens. This was someone saying, "I really didn't want this problem to be me, and I guess it is. Okay, I'm going to go and fix it." What is interesting is this was the same person who said their systems were 100% patched and 100% monitored. And that was true. They were. I've already told you what the problem was. It was a switch. This person basically got a support call. They turned up debugging to 10. They sent the debug logs off to the big switch company, and they got a patch back in 3 days. And that patch fixed the problem. However, the changelog didn't mention this particular fix. But really, this was the best that could have happened. And it only happened, because of the structure that we had. Okay. So you could say, this is like a bit of an obstacle course. We get a phone call. Oh no, we've got to get past the people who say, don't blame us. We've got to get past the people who say, try this. We've got to get past the idea of what to test next. And the problem is lost trust. And then you get to the end of the obstacle course, which is kind of funny, but it's not true. The scientific side of the problem solving, ruling things in and out, there was like an obstacle course. When we ruled something out, it stayed ruled out. But this problem also had like a layer around the outside of people stuff. And that people stuff never went away. The trust problem could be broken with, some unthoughtful words. And the communication, that's in both directions. So it was like you had to keep solving them and they never went away, which is different to the, very different to the, scientific type problem solving. So as a review, we solved it. And we solved it in a way where we set the thing up where the person who really didn't want it to be them basically said, okay, yeah, it's me. Now, has anyone got any questions? I can't see the questions.
I can read, there are three that came to
Yeah.
you. So the first one came from Dino. So do you have any advice for someone who is relatively more junior as to how they can go about finding the personal contacts of senior figures?
You can infer it by what they say, and what their ideas of what they're likely to suggest ideas, which, if they occur, they're happy with the outcomes. So someone who always says, we need to outsource this, we need to do, we need to save costs, we need to budget on this, basically their actions will belie their interests. So just listen carefully.
Okay. The next one came from Dave R. Did any third-party vendors get involved, switch provider, to come up with any suggestions / help?
They did, but at the start, the switch provider, if we'd have opened a support call, would have said, that's not us. Because we'd done such meticulous problem solving, we could go to the switch provider and say, no, this is definitely you. These are the tests we've done. Please fix this. And they did. They fixed it quickly, and it was a fault. No one writes perfect software. But if you've ever engaged a vendor and tried to get them to own a problem, you'll know how tricky they can be sometimes, even when you're paying them quite a lot of money.
He also had that we also have an issue with a VMware system that turned out to be a fiber channel host bus adapters, but getting third parties to even take a look or collaborate with each other was an absolute nightmare.
Isn't it? And this is where, all of us agreed, there obviously wasn't a problem with looking at that and thinking up which tests we could do to rule things in and out. That kind of wasn't the problem as much as the amount of time that these tests took and the priority and which ones to do in the right order. But having a journal and writing down what you know at the time and what you're testing and what you're going to find out is really useful, and then can be used to kind of say, we know what we're doing, we've tested this, and it really is you. There's a skill to having that kind of conversation. On top of the rest of the skills.
So Paul Stevens also asked a very interesting question. Did you have a firewall in brackets between the pointy-haired boss and the problem solvers?
Do you mean like we had people who I wasn't necessarily aware of all the pressure that some of the service managers were under for this. So in terms of those umbrellas were like firewalls of, we're going to provide, we trust you to solve this, and we're going to provide you with the environment that you can work your best in. I assume if it means a computer firewall, it had a load balancer, and after DNS, load balancers are next, right? They're always the problem. In this case, they weren't, but they always were. Is that any more questions?
Let me allow people to unmute themselves if they want to.
Okay.
Okay, so if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask a question to Mike.
If not, I'll go on to here's what I, takeaways. What does Mike recommend? Yeah, let's go on to that bit.
Yeah.
So, well, what does Mike recommend? Well, on the surface, the takeaways are, have a trusted generalist. It's kind of what I was. Maybe have two if your organization's big. One might be ill. I'd suggest be competent at visualizing things. It's both good practice with a C and good practice as an S. Just visualize stuff generally, because then when it really matters, you can do it and you know what you're doing. A coaching approach to perspectives and motivations, and what I needed was relentless good faith. Even in the face of people blaming things, relentlessly being good faith. As soon as you show bad faith, you lose trust, and you lose that that umbrella you need. And in general, you can try and aim for blame-free conversations and feel what that's like. You absolutely need blame-free conversations when you're problem solving like this. Everyone loves to blame the architects and operations and design and things, but occasionally see things from other people's perspectives. A takeaway might be having words for things. In fact, what I've done is a type of COP, of a common operating picture. And in the kind of blue light emergency services world, common operating pictures are, what do we know about this? What's every bit of evidence we have? How do we understand this problem? And once you've got a word for the fact that you need a common operating picture, you can say, well, what would be part of that? So having words for things really helps you work things out. And you need to know the type of problem you've got. Is it a problem you can throw science and experts at? Is it more complex? Is it a people problem that really won't stay solved? And of course, those are the on-the-surface takeaways. It gets more fun. Oh, but actually, I'll put those takeaways in another format. You can create blame-free environments in the team with rules and visuals. We're not going to blame people, and here's how we're going to decide what to test next. And here's a visual. We can point at the visual. We're not pointing at the person. That is really important. And trust creates umbrellas, really, so people can work. If you saw the picture of, the cascading umbrellas and the person at the end on the computer. Visuals and rules create trust. And creating a common operating picture, with actual pictures, that's what I'd recommend. And you can see the two sets of pictures I used. And they weren't anything special. They were just a mind map and they were a flow chart in Visio. But I did kind of mash OODA into that. But this is where too much lean will kill you, and not enough lean will also kill you. Because JIRA tickets that you probably don't create are tickets for plan for unlikely problems. They're not going to happen. They're never going to get prioritized. But also a ticket that says create trust. When does that ever move into the done column? And if you're a large organization, there's a good chance that you've got lean consultants looking to remove waste everywhere they see it. And quite a lot of what your generalist does might be considered waste by a lean consultant.
I have a few more questions, Mike. Is that okay if I read?
Yeah.
So King asks, how did you go about isolating systems that were tightly coupled? And I come from a software background, but I can imagine that this would also be the issue in this scenario.
Systems that are tightly coupled.
Yes.
I can't think of an example, but we did look at where we had, everywhere on that map, we said we have logs here, we have visibility here. We had New Relic software and New Relic browser, so we had visibility, and we knew where we had visibility. And if you like, that's a little bit like looking under a streetlight. Why are you looking under a streetlight when you lost something over there? And you say, well, this is where the light is. It's contextual, and it literally is. You just have to look at what you've got. And like with proper hard science, the things you can measure sometimes aren't the things that you care about. So you have to be smart.
The last question is for Adino. So yeah. Mike, can you expand on the coaching approach to perspectives and motivations?
So the coaching approach is really the relentless good faith of, even though you're saying things I don't like, I'm going to try and frame them in a way that is positive. You were employed to tell us, to rationalize our data center architecture. Of course, you're going to tell us we shouldn't have used Linux. Of course, you're going to tell us we should have moved to the cloud. So it's a kind of approach where, where are we? And let's look at what's going right. One of the last slides just says, where I got that coaching approach from. There's not many slides left. And we've got 4 minutes. This is good.
Okay.
So I was an IT engineer who knew they could solve any problem and make sure it didn't happen again. And that was my job. And I was quite good at it. And that's why I solved this problem, because basically the problem blinked first. I knew if I stared at it long enough, I could solve it. But really now I think that's only true for some types of problem. And there is a type of problem that I might not be able to solve in the time available. And I might not actually be able to ensure that similar things never happen again. You know, the type of problem matters. It might have been that I couldn't solve this problem in time. And yeah, I wasn't really used to that. Now, once again, the takeaways. People and stakeholders make sense, find out how. Manage the framing of the problem. You know, this is the perspective we're taking. This is how we're going to do it. The most important concerns are the experts' brain states and the rules that, govern the work. Always have visuals to point at when you're discussing problems, because without it, you're pointing at people. That's not great. And manage communications. There are some more takeaways. I've got 4 minutes left. Can anyone guess what the takeaways might be in chat quickly? This can be like a big reveal.
Okay, so Dave R asks, if you were to troubleshoot another similar issue, is there anything you would do differently?
I would create, now there is something called retrospective coherence, where you look at the past and you just make sense of it. But I did have a think about this. And one thing that I would do differently would be to keep a better journal of what I was thinking at the time and the decisions that I made. My journal wasn't bad, but I would do that better. So keeping a journal, yeah, that could be a takeaway. Is there any more before I reveal?
Yes. So in this case, the problem was the third party. If it hadn't been someone in the team, might have been blamed. Do you have any special advice on how to deal with the person in order to fix the problem?
Well, to fix the problem, you need them to help you, and they won't help you if they feel like they're being blamed. So you kind of just have to go, there's a problem, we have to fix it. This is our common goal. You know, we both want to meet our common goal. Let's do that first. And this is like an extended post-incident review, but years afterwards. There was a post-incident review. It didn't have half the stuff in that I've, with hindsight and time, come to realize what there was to learn. But yeah, these are not simple problems. And I should say, before this, I was studying complexity science and systems thinking with the Open University for years and reading books on this. And I kind of got the chance to apply some of the ideas from coaching and systems and complexity in real life. That was nice. But yeah, I didn't turn up to this unprepared, shall we say.
Quick one. So Sonia, this is still from Sonia, she says, takeaway, always have visuals to point at, so you don't point at the people. Yeah. Mark suggests that cake always makes things a little bit better.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that's number one now.
Dave mentioned that nice to have two Dave R's in the same chat. Dave R suggests that pizza first, Mark.
Yes.
Mark again had it, and you can't beat at a well-structured mind map. Great reminder that I should break this one out more often. And Sandeep is already thanking for the session.
Cool. Actually, I recently read that I think Netflix had looked at creating a similar end-to-end structure for working out where, you know, how to find problems. So yeah, a well-structured mind map where the position in the mind map is meaningful. You know, and you can collapse bits when you've ruled them out or put your hand over them or something is really useful. But a mind map that has 5 or 6 people's different perspectives in and they all agree that it's right, it's a little bit harder to make. Okay, so it's actually just gone 8 o'clock. There's only a couple more slides.
Yes.
The extra takeaways. Well, this is the exact problem. This is the exact sort of problem that can kill companies. And a company can run out of goodwill and options and money before the problem is fixed. We might have put a small cloud exam provider at our business if we were its main client, and they were going to use us as an example. And we said, we're not going to pay you till you fix this problem. And they'd have gone out of business before we fixed the problem, because when we outsourced it, we'd have probably got rid of our knowledge too. And so the time to find technical problems might be longer than the time you have to stay in business. And the kind of graph at the bottom, on the left, there's people who say you should run lean. Hope you never get a problem like this. And on the right, you might plan and spend lots of time and money to find and fix something that might not happen. And to give you an example in education, we already said there's not enough teachers and there's too many administrators. Are you really going to have more IT people, constantly making sure they can solve a problem that might not happen? So somewhere on here is right, but I'm not going to suggest I know where. So really, not many slides. I help experts visualize problems to help communication so that they can have a fighting chance on hard mode, because visuals also help on easy mode too. And visuals eliminate the waste of miscommunication in all problems. This is one of the takeaways, really. And I recommend that you and the people that work with you are confident creating meaningful visuals, when they don't have to, so that when they do have to, it's second nature. And I run a Draw Your Ideas workshop, if you're starting with a blank page. And this whole talk is actually an example of visual sense making and communication. I've thrown a whole load of stuff at you in an hour. Hopefully the visuals have helped. And this talk is it's CC by SA, so you can have and share these things, but you need to credit me. 2 more slides. I applied scientific problem solving to this. And if you work in IT, Brendan Gregg is the IT problem solver. You haven't had a problem that Brendan Gregg hasn't seen. Google him. I use clean language interviewing. Clean language is a method of, really, I used it to find out from what was in people's heads, make a map and a model of them with a minimum amount of bias. I use John Boyd's OODA for planning the next best thing. I use the brain state heuristic from systemic modeling, Caitlin Walker's work. And I use visualizations, which is my current work. But I didn't reinvent everything. I use swimlane flowcharts and mind maps. And some of the ideas about approaching the problem are from Kinevin, which is open source and on the internet at kinevin.io. Yeah, if you want to learn more in the sharing economy, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Substack, Mastodon, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Strava, if you want to follow me there. Or, I'm for hire, this is what I do. And then my website's there. And that is the end. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your interesting talk.
I can see the chat now. Wow.
Yes. It has been very active, which is great. I also posted a link for people to share their thoughts, also to propose new subjects. And if you want to follow Mike, by all means, we'll make available the presentation, right, Mike? And
there'll be a video of it.
Yes.
And my website is mikehaber.co. I think from there you can probably find me.
Okay. And Bev is here. Welcome, Bev.
Hello. I'll put my camera back on. Yes, thank you ever so much, Mike, for sharing that with us, and thank you everybody for your attendance, for listening, for your questions and comments. I hope you found it really useful. And yeah, please let us know your thoughts in the form that Pedro's linked to, and hopefully we will see you at some future events.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You.
Thanks. Bye.
How many people was there? I saw
6 around, if I'm not mistaken.
It was stable at around 44.
Okay, that's
I
good.
think a few must have left around the hour, but there was kind of 36 at the end. Let me just, should be able to.
Bev, I'm sending you the link
Okay.
so that you can see the information that we are capturing. Should be with you on your email now.
Can you still hear me, Paul?
Yes, Paul. Yes.
Yeah, I can't turn my camera on because I'm
What?
restricted.
Let me reactivate. Can now.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I was reminded of many of the incidents I had to deal with in the past, Mike, because I'm going to go back a long time. I had like the operations manager was about 3 levels above me, standing over me saying, when's this tape drive going to recover? When's it going to recover? Every 5 minutes. And in the end, my boss had to stand in between her and me to say, can you please go away?
Yeah. That is such a skill that you have to cultivate. But also the people going, that's Paul's problem. He's idiot. I don't know what he's done. You've got to manage that as well. Because as soon as you feel like you're being blamed for something, you kind of go, oh, God, it's not my fault. It's someone else's fault. Yeah, I'm kind of glad I was in the right place at the right time. Even though the stress, when it was done, I was like, great, I'm not going to think about that again. And it's only looking back at this, I've been able to go, so what did I learn? What did I do?
Yeah. I often say to a lot of the student placements we have that they should do a short stint, at least in their careers, in operations, especially when things go horribly wrong, because
that'll put them off. That'll put them off, Paul.
Yes, I know it.
Hi.
Yeah, fortunately, I was on call, but I was on call for systems which I'd both implemented, designed, and written the tests for. So when I got a call, I had some skin in the game. And if you like, I had skin in the game for doing it right, so I didn't get called out. I can't imagine what it's like getting called out for something which you're not responsible for fixing. If you're getting called out because developers have made some shortcut, done something badly, and you keep getting out of bed because of it, that must be awful. I don't know. Maybe you want students to see that. Maybe you don't. I don't know. It's uniquely IT, isn't it?
Often I found it was Occam's razor was the problem.
How did that show up?
I remember when I was working in PowerGen, that's what a changing to do with, I think it's to do with Tesco and getting some points. And so they put the change in. Anyway, within 10 minutes, I was being called and said, "Oh, it's your database. It's not working properly."
Yeah.
And I just said, "Have you only used the test set of data? You've got no indexes on that particular column, so it's scanning 5 million columns compared to the 5 million rows compared to the 10 you were in your test set. That's why it's not working."
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why at the start of this talk, I say this is the problem, because otherwise people are kind of guessing. Oh, I bet it was this. I bet it was that. Or they're looking at the perspective and choosing which one they'd have taken.
Yeah.
And I'm able to say, no one suggested the problem. All of the perspectives of the things we should do, none of them would have worked. This was the only way that would have got this particular problem.
Just for me, Mike, did the logs not show anything on the switches? Because one of the first things we check is logs on switches if somebody complains, or utilization reports, that sort of thing.
No, the person looking after the switches was meticulous in their documentation, and he could say they were running the latest firmware, and there was no errors in the logs because the switch was putting
the fact that the port went down, that would show up in the logs. Wouldn't that raise questions?
I don't think it did.
It must have done if the connection went down, or did it not go down solidly?
No, I mean, we did Wireshark traces, and it was literally
yeah.
like you pulled out the network lead and then put it back
Right.
again.
So the interface would have gone down.
There was no communication on the network that the switch was putting this into eco mode.
Mm.
We did, you know, we went through the network traces. There was nothing. It was like you pulled the lead out and put it back in.
Right,
So
it didn't say interface down or anything like that. None of that showed up.
No, not that. I mean, it was a while ago, but the experts, you know, I got them, and they when they put up debugging mode on the switch, like the vendor asked them to, and then sent the logs to the vendor said, "Oh yeah, here's a patch that will fix that." But it wasn't the switch working in normal operation, and so there weren't those kind of logging. It wasn't logging what it was doing because it wasn't doing the thing correctly. It was a fault. So my understanding, and of course, I was only expert on a small part of this. You know, I had to ask people and trust what they said. There were no errors on the switches. They were on the latest firmware.
Okay.
And yeah, but of course, you know, none of us thought it was the switches. We all thought it was something on the client, or it was the image being used. We were very surprised because, of course, you know, there were tens of things working perfectly fine at the same time.
Thank you very much. That was very good.
Thank you too. I'm going to have a cup of tea now.
Me too.
And I'll enjoy when the video comes out.